to the Level Up Artist Podcast. We're your hosts, Adriana May and
Jackie Sanders. We're two art professionals sharing forward the advice and business lessons we have learned along our creative journeys.
we talk to artists, leaders, and art professionals to demystify the creative process and discover new ways to succeed as a career-minded artist.
If you find value in these conversations, please go ahead and subscribe. This will help other creatives like you find our podcast, and you'll be notified when we drop a new episode every Tuesday. On today's episode, we're going to talk about adding murals to an existing art practice, because as two artists who are just starting off, we've obviously done paintings on canvas and panels before and still do, honestly, but exploring multiple income streams for our art business, both of us have recently gotten into murals and it's been so much fun, but definitely a learning curve.
Yeah, and it's been a fun process and one that took some time for us to start getting into. Like our first mural type experiences were years ago, but more recently we're like, wait a minute, we've given it a second look. It definitely took some additional considerations that we want to discuss today because as an art business, there are some income streams that are a little easier to add than others. And you've heard us talk about like different products, for example, whether original or reproducible, etc. But there are things like murals where there are some challenges involved with them. Like, yes, they're great, but there's also some things that are a little bit different about them. Versus like say something that you can do at home and then find a place to sell it through, making a painting in your kitchen table and then finding a home for it versus finding a wall for someone to let you paint outside. It's just a different dynamic when it comes down to it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And especially when it comes to your point about like an easier income stream to add. Of course, as artists, typically our first income stream is making original paintings, but then adding, let's say, prints to your process, photographing your work, getting them printed and having them then be a product to add is almost an easier logical step than completely skewing the scale, which again, we'll all go into those factors in today's episode. But before we dive in, I do want to have a quick disclaimer at the top in that murals and public art are not everyone's cup of tea. We are both still very new to this space and we are not experts by any means, but we do think it's valuable really to document and share our experience as artists in this area, because just 1 year ago, neither of us really had a ton of experience with murals, but it was on our goal list for this year. So kind of as a few steps into this space, not quite expert level yet, but we remember some of the concerns, some of the questions we had early on, and now having a few experiences under our belt, we think it's really valuable to share forward what we've learned, what's worth it, what's not worth it, some of the hard lessons we learned along the way, because that's what we do here. We share it forward with other artists who are in the process.
Yeah, and we've also had several artists we've interviewed on the podcast where we also asked them about murals, and that is their daily bread, so to speak. But now both of us have done them too. So now that we have a few solo murals under our belts and a few that we have been assisting other artists with, we want to kind of share kind of like at this initial stage, kind of some of the things we found. But yeah, let's kind of dive in. Jackie, how did you get started with murals?
Yeah, I feel like the process for you and I have been similar, but very different in like our first couple of quote unquote big murals, right? So I would say my first official one that I would count is one I'm actually working on right now. So it's with King's Auto, which is an auto body shop here in Raleigh. And it felt like really the perfect opportunity of like luck is when preparation meets opportunity, which is a quote that I really love, because I was working on a smaller piece for Skate Raleigh, which was a divider in the parking lot at a local skate park. And so it was like 10 feet by 2 feet high. So still bigger than anything I'd ever painted before in my studio practice, like on a panel. I think the biggest until then was like 4 or 5 feet. So it's still easily double what I had normally painted. So it's definitely a big step, but then this larger one at King's Auto is 30 feet by 10 feet. So very much different, but it came about when I was painting the smaller divider at Skate Raleigh, which we'll go into how that opportunity came up later. But essentially they saw my work there, really liked it. They approached me about doing a piece at their space, and then the rest is kind of in the process. Gave them a proposal, they signed it, gave them a contract, they signed that. And then of course the design approval process. But I think really that intrigue of murals has been building for a few years. And kind of in hindsight now, there are different elements along my journey that have led up to this. And so, yeah, I feel like the one I'm working on right now is the quote unquote big first mural, with the caveat of the divider at Skate Raleigh Park being the entry point into the world, which oftentimes that's how it happens with a lot of artists, is having a smaller project to get your feet wet and then diving into something bigger. But real quick, Adriana, how did you get started on your first like big mural project that you would count as your big one?
So I would count the big one, which if you've heard our podcast, we talked about it in the summer, I believe we had an episode about it. My big one is the Hillsborough one, the one off of Hillsborough Street, I should say. And that one started by building relationships with some of the creative placemakers that are in our town. One of them works for a nonprofit that was working together with another nonprofit, not confusing at all. And several stakeholders were involved. Both of these nonprofits mainly concentrate in the Raleigh area. And it was one of those like, hey, we think you'd be a good fit for this. Like, let's discuss. We've been looking at a few artists, but for this specific wall, this specific theme, etc., like, let's see. Can you put a proposal together essentially? What would you charge? Things like that. So I had to put a proposal together, made several designs. We had to make several revisions, which that was fine, but part of the process. And then um I decided with this one of the biggest things that came into play was making space for other artists to be able to learn and get paid. So this is one that Jackie helped me out on, as well as another artist called Anna Payne and Cindy Moorfield. And it was interesting. It's like we're all coming from different areas of expertise as it regarding to painting and murals themselves. So it's kind of like bringing the crew together essentially for this one, but it was big. It was like over 100 feet wide, and it started out at one story on one end, but it's two stories at the other end of it. It was a lot. It was a lot of work.
Yeah.
Really glad we did it, obviously. This is my first time doing a giant, well, for you muralists out there, you might be like, that's not a giant lift. For me, it was. So it was big towable lift. Like, there were a lot of things with it, but before then we did a few other projects, but yeah, that I'm gonna count that as the big one. Obviously, I have others that I have proposed that I'm waiting to hear back on at the time of this recording. So to be continued in terms of, will there be a bigger one on the map? But as of right now, but yeah, as you mentioned, Jackie, this isn't exactly where we got started. So let's kind of take the time machine for a spin. How did you get started?
Yeah, I think that's one thing that I found was the hardest part with quote unquote getting into murals or even just public art in general, is that it did feel intimidating, but that a lot of other artists that we talked to either on the podcast or in person, and through a amazing public art course that I took called Making Your Own Opportunities with Public Art. It was called like Momentum 360 program that Triangle Artworks hosts, which was absolutely incredible. If you're interested in public art, definitely look for that. I know they have different cohorts throughout the year. But they talked about how a big part of it is kind of getting those first few projects under your belt. And as much as we wish, you'd be like, yeah, here's a $200,000 project, like quit your day job tomorrow and then just do this big mural. That's not exactly how it works. Like, and you kind of think of the equivalent of, or at least I do, if you don't have any experience in an industry, or maybe you're just like a certain level in a company, they're not going to make you the CEO of a company based off of your experience. You kind of have to like work up to it in a sense to show the skill set for all these different applications. But then the common element of, well, I don't get experience unless I have opportunities, but I can't get opportunities unless I have experience, which is the vicious cycle. So it's the same in the corporate workforce, as well as within the art world. And so often with public arts and that, there are a handful of projects that are kind of in that $500 to $2,000 range, or projects where it is more volunteer based and maybe they cover the cost of materials, that may not be the most profitable up front in terms of compensating for your time or the materials, but you get paid with that experience that then you can leverage to get more profitable experiences, if that makes sense. So that's kind of how I viewed the skate park opportunity when I first applied for it. It was honestly a super simple application. There was like a link in their Instagram story to a Google Doc form, like not super official. I don't even think there was an entry fee. And they selected artists to paint these skate barriers. The amount they ended up paying $500 per barrier. So it definitely covered materials and some of my time. But it was a great experience and obviously then led to a larger, more profitable opportunity nearly a month later, which I couldn't have expected that, but that is kind of the natural escalation. I know Adriana and I, we've also done the Garner Art Around Town panels. So there was a temporary public art installation, where that was kind of the perfect hybrid for both of us to get our feet wet, and that it was going to be on display in the public, but they were panels that we could paint in our studio and then they were installed on site. So that's
Mhm.
also a super cool opportunity. But again, it wasn't like we're getting paid tons of money for them. It was more so the experience to see our pieces at that scale, and they covered essentially like materials for it. Where oftentimes that's an opportunity that artists can use to get their foot in the door to that world, but also you can assist other artists on their bigger murals, whether it's for a volunteer position or even like an hourly wage to get that experience. So as you mentioned, Adriana, I assisted on your mural, as well as, I mean, years ago when I was in college, I helped a New York muralist, Diana Cooper, install a mural on our campus, which was awesome as part of my grad school program. And then recently this summer, right after your mural, assisting Taylor White, who we had on our podcast, with an installation of hers. So each of those like opportunities where I was able to assist other artists, I found super helpful too, both from a skill set standpoint, but also just kind of learning the logistics of, okay, how does a 6 foot by 6 foot mural differ from a 100 foot mural, differ from a 300 foot tunnel mural? You know, like there's kind of those tips and tricks on site that you learn, that we're going to dive into a few at the end of this podcast to share with you guys. But there are so many of those that you just learn with the hands-on experience, which I think most artists can connect with in their creative practice. Some things you just need experience with.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of those things where a lot of the artists we've talked to, whether in person or through the podcast, will say too, where they're like, okay, for some of that experience, you do need to build out those first few projects, even if it's helping somebody else out. Um, get an idea of what's involved, see if you're actually really interested in it, and then start diving in. And then once you have a few projects under your belt, yes, you still have to look for projects, but after a while, or so they tell us, of course, and I know many of them say exactly the same thing, they're like, then other opportunities come up because you've been able to show quote unquote proof that you have the professionalism to get this through the process, right?
Yeah.
Which we'll talk a little bit more, but just to kind of throw it out there, like there's a lot more administrative work involved than you might consider. And not everybody's gonna cut it. I will say some of the opportunities I worked in, just like you, Jackie, it was the art around town was like one of the first times that I worked on a project that was a they called it like a temporary mural, essential, right? Or a mural, mobile mural, something along those
Hmm.
lines, because it wasn't meant to be permanent and it could be moved around. So that was really cool. Hillsborough, which I already talked about, Art Space, which I did a class, and I've done some classes that have to do with some mural techniques. And then I helped Chicago-based artist Ali Cantarella do a bakery. That was really cool. Just came back from the Dominican Republic recently where I met up with the other artists and we worked on murals together. So that was awesome. And then along those lines, besides public calls like you touched upon, Jackie, or trying to build the network, other ways too is like, and helping other artists, a few other things you can think about is like you could try to find mural groups, like specific interest groups, and see who's going out, who's doing a big project, who's asking for volunteers, whether paid or not. um or try to go to meetups, try to go to mural festivals, try to go to mural interests, like I said, interest groups, etc. um I mean, you could cold call the living daylights out of it, right? I mean, that is another way, and that's how some muralists do it, door to door. But yeah, some of these opportunities we're talking about, like, chances are for a business owner to say yes, unless you know them already, which that's another way to start. um
Mhm.
unless you know them already, they're going to say, show me what you've done before, to wrap my head around what it would look like. And especially if you're doing, like, say, a digital design and you can show them the before and after. Like, those kind of things are going to go a long way versus trying to sell someone an idea that you have no proof for. Now, luckily for those of us, and that's why, this topic is about adding it to an existing art practice. Those of us that already paint, especially if you already paint on a larger scale, it is going to make it a little bit easier for someone to visualize what it would look like on, one of your canvases that they can look at versus a wall. If you're just starting out, that's a little bit different, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later on. But yeah, a lot of it has to do with, yes, you need to get some experience under your belt, and there are many ways that you can get started, but you need to show, basically, you need to work through the ranks. Let's just go with that. You have to work
Right.
through the ranks, even if it's with some smaller projects first before you can go after the big ones.
Yeah, and I think that's really the key strategy is either like one or two things. It's like utilizing your network, whether with other small business owners, maybe a good family friend, a business owner that you've made connections with, that they are kind of taking that leap of faith on you, so to speak, which we all know you will do amazing and it'll turn out great. But it's like a lower stakes to where you don't necessarily need this elaborate portfolio to let them like invest in you, if that makes sense. They know
Mhm.
you, they know your character, they know your work. And then you can use that for a portfolio builder to prove to other people that you don't know that you can do it, or seeking those smaller, more portfolio building opportunities, whether it's a parking lot barrier, whether I know there's like the
Signal
newspaper,
boxes.
yeah, newspaper boxes, different like public arts where they say, hey, we have 15 of these like trash can containers around the city and we want to have them painted. I don't know, I'm just making some up. To where it's not a bunch of money, but you get that experience under your belt to show. Um, so those are really the two ways: utilizing your network or seeking some of those smaller opportunities and leveraging them. But there are also a lot of other factors to consider when even just deciding if you want to add murals to your portfolio. So I guess to start, Adriana, would you say would be some of the biggest upsides to adding murals to your portfolio if someone's like still on the fence?
I think of probably one of the first ones most artists might think about is money. especially if they're researching calls and things like that. And they're like, whoa, this hotel's paying 100,000 to paint the side of the building, type thing. So, that's one that definitely comes to mind as a potential. Why would you even consider it in the first place? If you right now sell smaller pieces of work, affordable art, maybe you're more into a product business, selling stickers or small prints or things like that. You're kind of like having to do volume in order to make a living out of it versus, how many stickers do you have to sell versus a $10,000 mural project? It's one painting, so to speak, right? So obviously there's different things involved, but a first thing that comes up is going to be money, or a lot of people, it's going to be money. Another one I would say is visibility. Think about it. A mural is basically a giant billboard for your art,
Mhm.
especially if, and we'll talk about this more, especially if it is a reflection of your body of work. So literally it serves as an advertisement for the rest of what you do. It also serves in a way as advertisement that you do murals. And somebody else might be like, oh my gosh, that's really cool. I wonder if they would do one for my building. So definitely the visibility aspect is huge. And then the other one that I think comes to mind, not as sexy, but definitely important, is professional experience. I mean, the fact that if you did do that bigger mural, now somebody may trust you to do an even bigger one than the last one, and so on and so forth. It shows that you have what it takes to work with a client, which a lot of times you're dealing with way more than one person. A lot of times you're dealing with a lot of people, in terms of what they want and the colors and the vibe and, paint this but not that, things of that nature, being willing to negotiate. Hey, if you're gonna ask me to revise that again, I'm gonna charge you hourly for revisions. Like, there's a lot more involved in terms of how to, conduct yourself in a professional manner and then get it all the way through the end till the project is completed. So it definitely shows to prospective clients that you're professional enough to get it done. So I think that's huge. That's another thing to consider. And in my brain, I go to, which it kind of like brings a lot of these together. I think a client, say a painting commission client, sees that you did a mural. They know that's a huge project, or at least I'm sure they'll guess correctly, it's a huge project in comparison to a painting commission. I'm pretty sure they're way more likely to trust you if they see you've been able to um execute a big project, and now they're asking you to do a big painting, for their family, for their living room, for example. I'm like, you're being able to show them like, yeah, I can do this. I can do this. I don't know. I think it's huge. I think it's huge.
Yeah, and I think that like professional experience is a great thing to touch on, but also an element that maybe that would be a reason why many artists would be very nervous to approach murals, because we kind of alluded to it earlier, but it is a very admin heavy income stream in that a lot of it is really rooted in the contract. It's rooted in, it's a commission, but at that scale, there's a lot of potentially having meetings with the client, revisions, as you mentioned, Adriana, but also just because at scale, there is more potential, the scary word of liability on you as an artist, to where like if something goes wrong or if there is something that needs to be changed down the road, it's very different than, oh, let me change out this color on a panel that's 2 foot by 2 foot for a client. It's, oh, well, that may be a 10-foot shape that needs entirely different color and therefore different paints and the whole nine. So the importance of the contract is really something that I think may also be a little nerve-wracking for artists, but it's that new variable that as you're getting into this space is something you work through, and it does require that upfront education, right? You're also dealing with different materials. Maybe some may be similar to what you use in your studio, but you have to deal with, okay, different scale. What surfaces are you painting on? And for the first handful of murals, which we're definitely still in the thick of that experience, to where painting on brick is very different than painting on a smooth cement, which is very different than drywall, which is very different than XYZ things, that all the surfaces add new variables. So a learning curve up front until you have a lot of experience under your belt. Especially just on-site painting in general. Like you're not in the comfort of your cozy studio on like a cold, rainy day, just being able to like get in the zone. You may be standing on the side of a busy street. Like my mural right now is like right next to Capitol Boulevard, which oddly is like very nice white noise, I have to admit, but there's added variables of like, oh, well, it's supposed to rain today, so I can't go paint this mural, even though my week was planned around painting this mural today. So there's those added variables. And as you mentioned, Adriana, with your mural being so big that you have to rent equipment, that's a whole other process, maybe hiring assistants. So from an admin logistics standpoint, that's at least where my apprehension was getting started in this space. Just because, not that it's information that isn't overcomable, to where like you can learn these things and you just learn by doing them, but they're just logistics that you don't have to think about traditionally in your cozy studio practice, where you have a restroom at your space, maybe you have food, like you have your day all within your control, versus there's just added logistics when you're painting on site for a mural.
You brought up a good point. You got to make sure there's a bathroom accessible just in case. Um, yeah, all these things definitely come into play. You know, obviously we don't want to deter you from considering it, but it's a lot more involved than, look, I just made this thing on my kitchen table and now I'm going to sell it. Like
Mhm.
there's a lot more involved with it. So we definitely
And
want you to know some of the factors that, or some of the things we had to learn through the
Mhm.
process. And
Yeah,
the
and also
bigger the
to just
projects.
validate your, if anyone is apprehensive to get into murals, like just to
Hmm.
validate, like it is, can be overwhelming at times,
Yes,
but it is something that can be overcome if it's truly what you want to do. But to the
exactly.
top of the episode, like disclaimer, like you don't have to do murals, obviously. Just like
Nope.
you don't have to do sculptures or don't have to do paintings. But to bring it up of, if it is something you want to do, everyone starts as brand new in this space, right? Like everyone starts with having no experience, and then you just slowly grow it from there.
Exactly. Even Da Vinci had to learn how to paint. Come on. But no, it's true. So that's kind of what we want to bring up with that. There's another element we have to talk about. Very, very important. We alluded to it earlier, and even the title of this episode alludes to it. It's if you have an existing art practice, this is going to be a little bit different than somebody that's starting from scratch, has never painted before, or maybe they've painted but haven't created a brand or style around their work. So definitely we have to talk about this. So um it's gonna be a I'm like I'm torn on this one. It's like it's a personal choice, but it's also a business choice. It's both. If you have a current body of work, you have a brand going on, you need to make a decision when it comes to adding murals, whether or not they're going to be similar to your current studio style, or are you going to focus purely on income? And what I mean by this is, let's say that your specialty, let's use a quick example. Let's say that your specialty is flowers. You paint flowers, you sculpt flowers, you do everything flower related, right? And somebody reaches out to you and says, "Hey, I'd love for you. I know you do murals of flowers and you paint flowers and all those things, whatever. I want you to paint a mural in my auto body shop. I'm going to use that as an example of like this Formula One car and a pickup truck and I don't know, an engine. I'm making this up, right? If your whole brand is about being a botanical artist, that's how you present yourself online, that's the kind of work that you do and you enjoy, you either say, yeah, I'm gonna try this car thing because I actually like cars too, and it would be a challenge and challenge accepted, and that's awesome, and the money's good, or you're gonna go, ugh, it that's too far from what I currently do and what I'm known for. I don't think I want to do that because then for somebody else that says, I'm going to look through your portfolio, if they see that car thing, does that mean now that other auto shops are going to reach out to you and ask you to do other auto related murals. That's different if you're doing abstract, and the abstract maybe doesn't really, you don't really have to worry about where it's located. But if it's a stylistic departure from what you currently do, then
Mhm.
that's something you want to think about. Now, doesn't mean you can't do it. Obviously, we all have bills to pay. And self-supporting artists having side gigs is not, it's not unheard of. That's what we do. So if you do choose to do something that's a big departure from what you normally do, show, display, etc., then something that we would encourage you to kind of consider is, would you do a separate brand for this? So you have, like, again, your flower related style, but then you have a separate brand, a separate Instagram, separate whatever you want it to be, where that is, yes, I do logos and I paint bakeries and I paint auto shops and I paint like anything you want. I'll paint your kid's nursery room with whatever their favorite Disney characters are. You know what I mean? But that way, your normal audience of collectors and people that follow you for the flowers aren't suddenly like, wait, you do all this other stuff too, which again, nothing wrong with that. Some of the muralists that I know, that is exactly what they do. What they're known for is that they can paint just about anything. They can paint super abstract, they can paint super realistic, they can paint cartoon style, they can paint logos, like you name it. However, the ones that I'm thinking about that come to mind, they also don't have like artwork at galleries. They don't sell their just canvases. They don't, you know what I mean? Like it is a
Mhm.
departure. They're more of a commercial painter business,
Right.
which is perfectly fine, still artistic, still valid. Like this is not what we're going into. Still creative, everything else, but they're not going the quote unquote art world route either.
Right.
They'll
They're not
literally paint
having to
anything.
add murals as an income stream to their already existing art business. Versus,
Correct.
well, yeah, what we're talking about, like if you start as a painter on panel or on canvas or whatever, and you're adding this in, then you have the
Mhm.
added factor of having to consider how does that incorporate from a brand perspective, but also just the style perspective into your current body of work.
Yeah, like does it actually expand your practice, or is it actually just a completely separate income stream if it is completely different from what you do? So it's like for both Jackie and I know several other artists like this, it's like whether it's a painting on panel, whether it's a sculpture, it's a sketch, it doesn't matter what it is. It could be a product, you can still tell it's us, right? We have a consistent style that we very mindfully and very purposely carry across all our work, because if you see one, it gives you an idea of what the other parts look like. And then as a consumer, as a collector, you can choose what you want. Oh, I like the sticker and I also like the painting and I also like the hoodie. Like I'm making it up for a second, right? But like they're all still the same artist identity. But anyways, food for thought. We want to make sure we bring this up to you. Something to think about if you have an existing artistic style and way that you present yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's definitely something to think about. And it always is a personal choice after all. But real quick, we are going to share also some practical tips and tricks that we have learned in our experience with murals. But first, a quick word from our sponsors. This episode is brought to you by the Level Up Artists business community. This ever-evolving membership values community over competition and growing connections with fellow creatives who share the same goals and challenges as you.
Life as a modern artist can be both exciting and overwhelming. Art school or self-taught, emerging or seasoned professional, there's a lot of information out there, but what do working artists actually need?
Other industries have continuing education programs for their professionals to sharpen up their skills and stay up to date with the systems, technology, and tools needed to succeed. And we believe that artists should too.
We've spent countless hours of trial and error weeding through tons of information to find the gold and creating sustainable systems that actually work so you don't have to waste your time going down endless rabbit holes.
We are passionate about exchanging ideas and sharing resources with fellow career-minded artists about the business side of art. From artist documents and exhibition prep to templates and tools to help you work faster and smarter, our course modules cover everything from social media to technology and sustainable studio practices too.
Ready to get started? Head on over to levelupartisthub.com to learn more, get immediate access, and level up your creative career today. Welcome back, everyone. So we'll go ahead and dive straight into some of these tips and tricks. Like we mentioned earlier, we're not experts on this yet, but there's a lot we've learned along the way, and it's fresh enough for us that as we discover these things, we want to be able to share with you. Also, if you do art commissions already as part of your practice, you're going to notice a lot of these processes are actually very similar, especially when it comes to the prep work, the part that has to do with the design and the contract, the admin bits of it. Some things we want you to think about. You need to be clear and firm on your pricing. um for sure. On your contract, you want to make sure you specify what your design fee is in case they back out, and how many revisions you're willing to make before they incur extra charges. If you don't charge for revisions, they're going to keep going. So you definitely have to put this in here somewhere and communicate it up front with your potential client. Also, you want to make sure, this one's, I feel like, an easily overlooked but extra important. You have to have written approval. Make sure you have this in writing. And yes, email counts, from the owner of the building or whatever surface you're painting on, that you have their approval, that you're going to work on it. You don't want one of the employees to say, yes, do it. And then the owner finds out and it was not approved. And now you got to paint over it. Nobody wants that. So make sure the owner is part of the conversation and you have their acknowledgement in writing.
Yes, definitely. And even in the beginning parts of the process, that's one thing you can ask, is saying like, well, who will the final like decision maker be for this process? Ideally have a point of contact early on, even if they have a team member of theirs that is in the kind of nitty gritty of the contract and the design. But it's good for you to know like, oh wait, Susan, who I've been talking with for 3 weeks, she actually doesn't have the power to say if we can do this mural or not. So now it's been all the admin time, it's been all the design time, and it might void the contract at that point. So definitely something to think about. Also, in terms of that timeline, ideally being able to get a deposit at least 2 weeks in advance so that you have enough time to order materials, receive them. Like if you're trying to find assistance, you can maybe pay them a little bit up front and really have those necessary equipment rentals so that it's not having to come out of your own pocket. Different projects are different timelines. Typically, if you get the contract signed, there is a percentage up front just with that sign approval. Everyone structures their contract differently, but that's definitely something to consider to minimum cover all those material costs and your design cost up front. And then when the percentage is paid later, that's icing on the cake, essentially. Because you want to remember to conduct yourself in that professional manner, be understanding that there are moving deadlines and various team members involved, especially if you're doing a mural in a new construction zone, working with a developer. There are different timelines that may affect the mural timeline, but also standing confident in the value that you're bringing, the contract you have in place, and making sure that you're not necessarily going completely out of your way to make projects happen if the same isn't happening for you. So there's a professionalism there as well, especially when thinking about on-site logistics too. One thing that I've definitely learned when doing some of these larger projects where it's multiple days of painting, it sounds super simple, but setting set times aside for water breaks, maybe even stretch your body before, during, and after painting, it really is great, obviously, to get in the zone with your painting and you hear the white noise of the streets near you and you're just like going to town on this mural. But murals, especially at large scale, are like they're a marathon, not a sprint. Like it really does test your physical endurance. So making sure that you're fueling it with great foods, having water, keeping it in good physical shape is super important when you're on site.
Yeah, and especially if you're outside, protect your skin, wear sunscreen, hats, proper clothing. Yes, we all want to look good while we do the job, but also, don't let your body temperature rise up because yeah, the sun. It's gonna happen.
Yeah. Another good thing when it comes to like logistics on site that I found was super helpful, especially between the skate rally mural and this one that I've done, is printing off a physical copy of your design. You can probably get away with it if you're doing an indoor mural, but when you're out in the peak sun of the day, trying to like use your hand to cover the iPad screen to see your design, you're like, where does this shape go again? It is just so much easier to have a printed version on paper that you can refer to when designing, sketching, or even just to show people passing by that ask, what are you painting here? Like, this is the design. Great. Keep walking. I'm working here.
Yeah, and if you're outdoors, that iPad can get hot and the screen will turn off. So there's
Oh,
that.
yeah.
You have to have shade. If there are no convenience stores nearby, and or the person at the site doesn't have a fridge or a kitchen type situation, you may want to consider bringing a cooler so you can keep water, food, snacks, etc. There's nothing like on a hot day. You can have that ice cube to like freshen yourself up a little bit and cool yourself off, but definitely stay hydrated and have some snacks at hand.
Yeah, and on the note of packing, I found it super helpful to pack your materials in either like crates or big bins. One, it just makes it easier when transporting all the materials to the site if it's in between like a parking lot and the site. And when you're driving, it's helpful because you don't have to worry about paint exploding in the back of your car, water sloshing around everywhere. So just having them in big containers keeps you very organized and logistically is very helpful.
I know you just said that, and I'm like, add folding cart to the list, because then
Yeah.
said containers full of paint can get really heavy, and you want to protect your back too, as you're transporting things and back and forth for sure. Also, it goes without saying, but we still have to say it. You need to invest in good tools. They don't have to be expensive. They need to be decent quality. It'll save you time, money, and frustration.
Absolutely. And when it comes to the level of professionalism on site, make sure you leave it clean, organized in between painting sessions. You want to make sure you leave a good impression because that also is an element of your professional reputation.
Yeah. And as we wrap up, as always, community over competition, rising tides, people. Don't be afraid to ask other muralists and artists for help. Also, be open to helping them out too while you're on this journey. But with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up today's episode, and we hope you learned a lot from this one.
Yes, hopefully these tips and tricks will help you with your first or next mural project. And we are always here to answer any questions that you may have. And as always, our blog will be linked in today's show notes, where you'll find episode notes and links to all of our other podcast episodes.
If you want to stay connected with us in between episodes, share feedback, or have a question you would like for us to answer on the podcast, you can reach us through social media. I'm at Amate Art across all platforms.
And I'm at J Sanders Studio on all platforms. And if you want to follow the podcast, we are at Level Up Artists on Instagram. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.